When I was young, I admired clever people. Now that I'm old, I admire kind people. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Nishant, and welcome to another episode of the Nishant Garg Show. The mission of the show is to spread awareness on mindfulness practices, psychology, mental health, and spirituality. My job on the show is to invite world class performers to share the practices to live a fulfilled life. Today's guest is Tara. Tara is a clinical psychologist and author of The Kindness Cure: How the Science of Compassion Can Heal Your Heart and Your World. She currently works as a staff psychologist at Harvard University's Counseling and Mental Health Center. She is trained in mind-body medicine from Harvard Medical School. She is a certified mindfulness meditation teacher and a facilitator of the Daring Bay method in practices of courage and resilience based on the research by Dr. Brené Brown. She is devoted to bringing kindfulness practices to individuals, schools, and workplaces. In this episode, Tara discusses about kindfulness, mindfulness, compassion, negativity bias, glad practice, gratitude, fixed mindset, courage, sacred pause, and much more. To know more, keep listening. Tara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I'm thrilled to have you on the show all the way from Boston. How is Boston doing these days?
Well, there's a lot of activity happening, I would say. A lot of peace protests and marches and a lot of energy in the air.
I bet. How would your family describe now what you do for a living?
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at one of the local universities, so I speak with students, undergrads and graduates all day long. I also write on occasion, and I teach mindfulness and self-compassion. So I don't know really what I would call myself. I'm pretty much of an eclectic hybrid. I like to do lots of things.
Clinical psychologist, mindfulness, self-compassion. This is a very deadly combination. How it happened?
Well, I think it was a required elixir to help cope with life, being an empath, listening to so many stories and people's lives and their sufferings and their joy, that somewhere along the line, I really shifted my focus in terms of how I did my own work and my own personal work to daily practices of being present, being compassionate, in particular towards myself, because I am a caregiver in many different forms. And so it was like a turning for me. I would say about 10 years ago, even though I've been practicing these sorts of things for at least 22, 25 years, but really in earnest, starting to educate myself, going on retreats, getting trained, that sort of thing. So I've really committed to that, to mindfulness and compassion as a practice. And I feel like that's primarily what I teach the people I work with.
So mindfulness and compassion, isn't it part of psychology?
Well, it is a part of psychology. It's a big part of psychology now. You know, there's this sort of third wave of psychotherapy approaches, which is really post-cognitive behavioral therapy, that's really bringing the piece of mindfulness and acceptance and compassion in a much larger way than it ever was before. And one of the beautiful things, having now basically 2 decades of perspective, is that the research has just been phenomenal about the benefits of these sorts of practices in terms of mind, body, but real strong outcomes for physical health, emotional health, resilience, well-being, post-traumatic stress disorder, you name it. So I think that we're really seeing a lot of gravitas with these skills. I like to joke that it's sort of like science is proving out ancient wisdom, essentially.
So as a clinical psychologist, how does mindfulness help you in your personal life?
Well, mindfulness in its very sort of simple form is being aware of the present moment as it unfolds with curiosity, without judgment. And we really need to be present when we are having conversations with other people. right? If we're too much in our mind or we're diagnosing or that sort of thing, we're not really present for another person, and that's a disservice. So mindfulness really is a very important practice in the work of doing counseling or therapy.
Does mindfulness suitable for a specific group of population, or anybody can practice that?
Well, I am of the opinion that anyone can practice it, but there are some caveats because one really needs to explore and play with mindfulness and try it out in its different forms. You know, a lot of the skills are based on having a resource anchor or an attention point, like the breath, for instance, or feeling your hands on your lap, your feet on the floor. And we have to be very sensitive to people who may have sort of a paradoxical experience with focusing on their breath, for instance, you know, people maybe with trauma or asthma and things like that. And so we have to be careful. Like, we can't say mindfulness is the cure for everything, but it's certainly a very important element.
And as a listener to this podcast, I'm thinking, should I go to a clinical psychologist or a mental health professional for any trauma in my life? Or should I go to a mindfulness teacher, or what should I do?
Well, that's a very broad question. I think it depends on what it is that is pulling on your heart, right? Now, if someone is fairly well resourced and has fairly good basic wellness practices, learning mindfulness with a teacher in a more formal way can be really beneficial. If there is significant distress or trauma, I think having a trained professional, whether that is a clinical psychologist or a social worker or a licensed mental health worker or a psychiatrist or clergy, right? There are many kinds of healers in the world, and we really need to kind of find the right person for us, and it might not necessarily even be in a mental health model.
Have you taught mindfulness to your children?
Yes, you know, I have actually a really funny story because my children, I have two daughters, and they are now, 19 and 22, right? So one's in the middle of college and one just graduated, well, sort of virtually graduated. And I have my office in my home. I'm very fortunate in that way. And as kids, they would come running through when I'd be meditating or journal writing in the morning. And they would, you know, they didn't read the signs that say, you know, peace, do not enter. But I feel like they actually really absorbed it. I never forced anything on them. But I feel like what I'm finding now is how we behave in the world and our role modeling is so key, and it's so much more important than what we say. But because we've been cooped up together as a family of four, you know, sort of life has been interrupted for my daughters, who are young adults, and they want to be at school and celebrate with friends and, you know, do all the normative things of you know, young people these days. And so now they're stuck back with their parents. And we were used to the empty nest too. And now we're all adjusting as four adults in the home. And so we're having dinner more often together. And so the other night, or not the other night, I mean, typically on a night, I will always ask, what was the high point of your day? You know, tell me something that was sweet or funny or inspiring. And that's not to dismiss the negative, but it's really just to get an engaging conversation going. And there's one skill, and it's actually I love acronyms, by the way. So I teach a lot of acronyms to my students. There's an acronym called GLAD, GLAD, and it's by a therapist who wrote a book like 101 Mindfulness Tools or something like that. But it's very simple. And
what is GLAD?
Yeah, it stands for, so G stands for name one gratitude today. L stands for name one lesson learned. This doesn't need to be anything epic. It might be as simple as, I realized I really needed to have more patience today. Right. A stands for name one accomplishment. Small accomplishment. Doesn't have to be something epic either. And then D is delight. Name one delight. And so we go around the dinner table now, or when we're actually together, and I'm like, all right, let's do GLAD. And they don't have to name each letter, but at least one thing, you know, one of those four. And it really helps to spark a conversation, and it gets us really engaged and present. So yesterday, so my daughter is in graduate school now. She wants to become a physical therapist, and unfortunately it's online. And so they're in their orientation week. And so they had a whole class on mindfulness. And she texts me. She's doing her classes right above my office. She's like, Mom, we had a conversation about mindfulness. And I actually offered the GLAD technique, and everybody laughed, and they were like, wow, that's really fun. That's really great. So I know now that just these tiny little skills, gratitude, appreciation, reflecting on what's beneficial in your day, really start to build resilience. And it's sticky, right? So I haven't explained to my daughters what I explained to my students, because so many of them suffer from imposter syndrome or perfectionism or procrastination or never feeling like they're good enough. And it's a very common experience for most of us. And so I teach a lot about the negativity bias and how our attention always goes to things that we experience as threatening, which often are things in our own minds, right? The stories that we tell ourselves. And so one way to really shift that negativity bias to cultivating a positivity bias is we really actually have to attend to these small moments that happen in our day so that we don't miss out on them, right?
You are not alone in this journey. We all struggle in life. There is no shame in talking about it. I go through my highs and lows. I get depressed, but these practices really help me in living a resilient and mindful life. You can also do this. You got this. Don't judge yourself. Could you explain more on negative bias? And I want to ask you, is there any instance in your life recently when you were having negative story in your mind and you shifted the narration to a more positive side?
I have so many stories. I wouldn't even really know where to begin, to be honest with you. But, I think in the last week, I've been feeling very sad and angry and just frustrated with the racial pandemic that we have. And really helpless as a white woman. I really feel sort of the pain of my colleagues, my Black and brown colleagues who are just so tired of this and really feeling quite sad and almost despairing. And, I just said, you know what, I'm going to just go online for 5 minutes, because I kind of like titrate how often I'm online because it's usually upsetting. And I just came across an interview with Martin Luther King's daughter, Reverend Bernice King. And the interviewer had asked her, do you think that we've come any farther than the 1960s? Like, are we just really in the same place? And Bernice King answered she said, well, there are more circles of white people now. There are more circles of people who are opening up their hearts and they're opening up their souls. So she said, I think it's different this time. And that was such an important reminder for me to redirect my attention to this image, if you will, of widening circles of care, which is actually what I wrote about in my book, The Kindness Cure. And I had to remind myself that there are circles of care. And right now, in this moment in time, they are widening. And there seems to be a shift in my mind and in what I am hearing from my colleagues and peers that maybe things will start to go into a different direction. So I feel hopeful, but I could have stayed in a state of despair for, a long time. And I feel like I go up and down during the day, but we have to redirect our attention to the things that are going well, to the moments that we see where there is something constructive being done, to the energy and the action that we might be witnessing. So that is a redirection. That is redirecting attention. And honestly, we have to do this all the time.
Somebody would be thinking, what is going well? There is coronavirus, this global
Mm-hmm.
pandemic. There is racial discrimination on the other
Mm-hmm.
side. How can we be more kind, compassionate toward others and towards ourselves?
So we need to remember our humanity and each other's humanity. And if we allow ourselves to get caught in empathic distress, right, where our hearts are breaking or we're feeling so helpless, it's so important to name that. The first thing is to acknowledge it and name it. We are not pushing it away. We are not trying to dismiss it or change it. We need to actually face it. And at the same time, hold in the same space the goodness that we see, because it is there too. Like it all belongs. It's all part of humanity. But it's up to us to really pause and then redirect. Where can I have some influence? Where can I bring care? And it might be to yourself first, right? It really might be taking care of your own sadness, your own grief, your own anger. We have to start with ourselves.
Could you walk us through some of the kindness cure practices as part of your book, or any other practice that can help our listeners to be more kind toward others and toward themselves?
Well, there's so many different ways, and I want to go back to the question you asked before, like say a little bit more about the negativity bias, because I feel like this very simple understanding of where our attention goes is so much rooted into our hardwiring, right? So on a very primitive, primal level, well, if you think about it this way, like all day long, our hearts are beating, our lungs are breathing, and our brain is scanning. It's scanning all day long. It's kind of like a home surveillance system, right? And if there is disturbance there, if there's some sort of threat or potential danger or discomfort, guess what? That attention, our scanner is going to go to that. That's why we really have to actually titrate how much we watch the news. We cannot help it. We are wired to look for danger. We're wired to look for difference. And having an understanding that happens below our level of awareness helps us catch ourselves when we've actually been hijacked, right? When we've been hijacked by the negativity bias. So some of the neuropsychologists, I think of a teacher of mine, Rick Hansen, he describes it this way, our brains are like Velcro for the negative, and it's like Teflon for the positive. So the negative stuff is really sticky, and we really can't help it. It's not our fault, right? It's just a quirk of evolution that system has not evolved. And we need it. And we need it for survival, right? We need to know that, if someone's run a red light, we have to jump out of the way, right? We need that system in place. But it also means, that we have to really make the positive sticky like Velcro. We have to redirect our attention to the moments day in, day out that are really beneficial to us. And so one of the ways, based on Dr. Hansen's teaching, which I have in my book, is like, how do we kind of create sort of a kindness map for ourselves? And so really one of the things that we can do is pay attention, right? The first step is really pay attention to those moments in the day that are either positive or beneficial in some way. And often these things happen spontaneously. It's a beautiful day out, or someone sent us a lovely text, or you watched your child learn something new, right? And it brings a smile to your face. Like we have these things happen spontaneously all the time, but we don't really stick with it. So after we notice that something delightful has happened, we really need to stay with it. We need to stay with it a little bit longer. And here's where mindfulness comes in. It's really that element of savoring that moment, savoring the experience, like, all the sensations, all the five senses, sight, smell, taste, all the vision, all of that. Like we really want to enrich it. We want to stay with it a little bit longer. And this is so important so that we can install this experience, this memory into our hippocampus, into our brain, as a resource. something that we can recall and we can remember. And so something like, saying 3 gratitudes or doing the GLAD practice, for instance, is a way of really kind of enriching and installing a beneficial or positive experience.
What if there is a deeper pain? Can we resolve or mitigate those deeper pains through GLAD or gratitude practice?
Well, yes, we can. But it's an excellent question, because there are experiences that are really just very intense suffering, right, and pain. And so this is really where the practice of self-compassion, self-kindness is so key. And, self-compassion is really defined as having 3 elements. The first element is this mindful awareness of kind of holding the good and the bad, the positive and the negative emotions in a balance, right? That we actually harbor both. We're human beings. We have diversity of emotions. We're really being mindful of that. Another element of self-compassion is common humanity. That my specific situation might be unique and specific to my experience, but the experience of pain, anguish, distress, sadness, that's a very, very human experience. And we are not alone with that. And it's to remember that this is part of the human experience, 10,000 joys, 10,000 sufferings. And the third element of self-compassion is self-kindness. And in a very simple way, self-kindness is really treating yourself as you would a friend in need or a friend who is suffering. Right? Now, I work with a lot of students who have a really hard time with this step of self-kindness, right? They're taskmasters. They have to keep perfecting and performing. They're really relentless and harsh, and they have a harsh inner critic, about being good enough. It's
negative self-talk.
Very negative self-talk. They have an inner critic, and actually I do a lot of work on helping people name their inner critic, because part of the work is befriending that inner critic. But with self-compassion is sometimes we have to kind of skirt around the edges, because applying kindness to ourselves almost feels like a weakness or too indulgent, or that we don't deserve it, right? So developing a language around how to be kind to oneself. And one simple way is to imagine a friend who might be going through something very similar to you. And then what would you say to that person, who might just be going through a divorce or is in recovery and having a hard time? What would you say to that person? And when people start to actually write these sort of statements down of what they would say to somebody else, it's often with, there are often things like, listen, everything is going to be okay. You're working so hard. This is going to pass. This is a part of life. I'm here for you. You're going to talk in a kind tone. You're going to have sort of encouragement statements. Now, the trick is, can you apply that to yourself, right? And at first, it doesn't, for some people, it feels so foreign, right? And this is where fake it till you make it actually works. You just have to keep trying and saying it and writing these things down until you start getting more fluent and comfortable, if that makes sense.
It does. Tara, I want to ask you, has it ever happened that people would say, yeah, Tara, this is easy for you because you're a psychologist. You have so many data points. We have done this so many things in the past, but this is not easy for us. How can we do it?
Well, there's always resistance. And, what I say back is I practice this every day because I have suffering every day too. And that is a part of my existence. And this is how we do it, and then, teach how to attend to the breath, or how to do a body scan, or to teach a loving kindness meditation, where you include yourself in the circle of care. I have found, and it might be because the population that I tend to work with is so high strung and they're high achievers, is I really have to work with helping them identify their inner narrative and then name their inner critic, right?
What kind of people do you work with usually?
So I work at Harvard University's Mental Health and Counseling Center with undergraduates and graduate students primarily. And then I have a private practice also, and, often high achieving professionals. And I have a third chair in my office for the inner critic because I invite it in. Once we've identified what the quality or the characterization of the inner dialogue is, we name it. We then can work with it. And I'm happy to give you an example, if you need one, but
please go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of actually last fall, I run a 10-week workshop series called Overcoming Perfectionism Through Self-Compassion. I also have a version of it on Insight Timer, the audio version of it. But in one of the workshops, we as a group actually think about, and I'll invite your listeners to think about an experience maybe in the last 2 days or last week where you found yourself really beating yourself up, right? Where you might have been feeling bad about something that you said, or maybe something didn't go right. Think of that experience and really kind of just give it a label, write down your thoughts. What if you can think about that narrative, what were you saying to yourself, and the kind of tone that you might have been using, and really just kind of get back into that place. Now, there's a caveat. I usually say to people, this is a workshop. This is not group therapy. If you're going to think of something on a scale of 1 to 10, like 10 being the worst. Pick something in like the 3, 4, or 5 range, right? Because we do want to have a dialogue and we want to share about it. And so sometimes we have to work with the things that aren't like the most traumatic thing, right? Please. We're going to work up to that. But they find an example, or they'll find something. And then we'll share. Write down actually on a note card, and then they'll hand the note cards up to me, and then I will, and no one knows who wrote what, but then I will read it out loud. And I'm telling you, it's very humbling to hear what people write down. I mean, I'm not going to use like bad language, but it's going to be like, you loser, you should have known better. How could you have done that? You keep doing the same mistake over and over again. You're never going to get ahead. Right. And then they'll write the word like, the tone is harsh or mean. And then afterwards we sit in silence. And, I ask for reactions, and people are like, wow, that's really mean. That's really harsh. That's kind of scary. Right. And then we have this opportunity to name that voice. And usually that voice is an inner taskmaster or an inner judge, sometimes an inner cop. Right. And that's why it's really helpful to know what the narrative is and the quality of that voice. So I'll give you one example. So one young woman, a graduate student, she shared, right. She said, I realized that what my behavior was and what I was doing is that before I could even sit down to get my work done, like maybe a paper or a thesis, I would have to make sure that my entire desk was pristine and clean. And once that was done, I would look around, and then the rest of the apartment had to be clean. And then I would wash my roommate's dishes. And then by, 5 hours later, I would come back to my desk, which was totally clean, but I hadn't even done one sentence of work. Right?
Procrastination.
Total procrastination, right? And she had this fear, right? And so she named her inner voice, her inner Monica, after the character on the Friends show. So I don't know if you're, the comedy Friends, there's a character, Monica, and she's always wiping down the counters and putting away the coffee cups. And she's really kind of like anal, compulsive. And everybody in the room started laughing, because in recognition, like, oh yeah, right. So she started to call her inner narrative Monica. And what this allowed for her to do was to have a relationship with her inner critic, because her inner Monica would show up when anything was kind of hard to do, or she was scared about the outcome. What if I'm not going to get an A? What if this isn't going to be right? What if I'm not smart enough? So then the task was, well, how do we help you counteract this inner Monica? What are some of the things that you can say? Right. And so then the next part of the exercise is really cultivating this kinder voice. Now, in this woman's case, she, I always say, like, your inner Monica or your inner Judge Judy or your inner cop really is a signal. It's a signal, just like a heartbeat or a sensation is a signal. It's a signal of fear or rejection, usually one or the other. right? And so when that signal, when that inner Monica pipes up, for you to pause in that moment and say, oh, Monica, why are you here? Oh, right. This is really important to me, right? So one of the things about the inner voice is that it is conditioned. It's like a conditioned mental pattern that has often been there for many years and has actually worked for people. It's gotten them their straight A's, valedictorian of their class. It's helped them succeed in the world. But it's not working anymore because...
Do you think it could be because of the fixed mindset that we have this inner critique voice?
You mean like an imposter syndrome?
Yes.
Well, that's an element of it. We could describe it as imposter syndrome. Like if you actually like went online and did like the imposter syndrome quiz, you can find it online. There's like 7 questions, and often they're just kind of like, I must have gotten here by luck. This wasn't really based on my talent. I shouldn't really be here. Those kinds of things. That's part of it. For some people, that's an element. It's definitely part of it. But I don't want to always craft it as imposter syndrome. I think often, and with some inner, like the inner judge, often can come from like a really harsh upbringing, corporal punishment, let's say, or just, sometimes families where feelings aren't mentionable. Right. And so children are very creative, and they'll come up with strategies in order to thwart or protect themselves from punishment or rejection in some way. So there's many different reasons why we can have these internal dialogues and why they're there. And I think it's a really important point because we need to befriend that inner voice. Like that woman needed to befriend her inner Monica because it was really coming from a place of fear of rejection. And when she could see that, she could start to have compassion for herself and then recognize also like, oh, maybe there's another approach. Like, okay, Monica, you can sit over here now. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to try for the next half hour to sit at my desk and write the first paragraph. And that's what this woman started to do. And so, I think that that's just one example. It's kind of like a simple, obvious example, but there are many other examples where people are very, there's trauma in their background or other sorts of things, and they just don't even feel deserving of kindness, let alone from themselves. It feels very uncomfortable. And so, this is not to rip the Band-Aid off of someone's life. It's just say, let's skirt the edges. Let's just start with attending to your breath.
Do you feel that if we can teach compassion, kindness, mindfulness, and basic skills or basic life skills to teenagers, we can literally change the world for a betterment? I
totally believe that. I feel like, there's a movement in education, the SEL, social and emotional learning. And I always say that we need remedial training on empathy, but in some cases we actually need training on empathy, and it needs to happen repeatedly and over time. So if I go back to cultivating this idea, cultivating a positivity bias, is that we have to train ourselves and practice over and over and over again. How can we be generous today? How can we bring kindness to this moment? How can we take good care of ourselves? And practice that, because that is what grows stronger, right? So if our attention is going to go to something that's negative and we can catch ourselves in it, we need to say, oh yeah, I need to redirect my attention. How can I cultivate something that's positive or good right now? Because it matters. It matters to my well-being, and it matters to the well-being of others, right? I think it is a practice.
A lot of people would know about all these things. It just reminding when we are into that negative bias, when we are going through some deep pain in our life, then how can we remind ourselves? That is the main question, because we keep going deep and deep into that downward spiral.
Well, we can't do it alone. So this is the importance of, this idea, going back to the very beginning, is these widening circles of care. It's one thing to practice mindfulness or do a loving kindness meditation by ourselves, but we really do need community, and we need to have conversations and engage and practice. In the helping literature, actually like volunteering even 1 hour or 2 hours a week is known to actually increase longevity. Like it adds years to your life if you volunteer once a week. With teenagers, going back to your question, volunteering, 2 hours a week, not for your family, something that takes you outside of your comfort zone is a preventative for risky behaviors, alcohol, early sexual, initiation, all of those sorts of things. We know that helping behaviors are preventative in health. And it should be one of the number one prescriptions. And I think what's happened in our success-oriented culture is what we see with teenagers, and I got very frustrated with my own children in high school, is that they were looking for, the community service hours. Hey, Mom, can this count as a community service hour? I'm like, no, go to the soup kitchen and really help somebody. It's not picking up the sticks in your own yard. It's actually going out and helping other people or another cause and getting out of your own mind, right? So I think that if we have this prescription of how can we help somebody today, or if I'm going to pick something, what is really meaningful to me that is local, where the barriers are low, right? Because the more barriers are up, we are not going to really do much of anything. So if we can find some way to help clean up the neighborhood or go to, an assisted living home, any of those things, we would actually do a lot for our own health.
I would love to hear that whenever you have any trouble or any suffering in your personal life, who is your go-to person, or who do you go to in your life?
It's so interesting. I have, and this has really only been over the last 4 years, I joined a women's singing group, and I had a lot talk about the inner
Women's
critic.
singing group. Wow.
Yeah. And it's become this sort of spiritual, we meet once a month, and the leader, she is a spiritual leader. She has her master's in divinity, but she started actually with children, like, music together, but she's been teaching circles of song for many years. And I thought I had a milestone birthday, and I thought, it's one of those questions like, what would I do if I knew I couldn't fail or I wouldn't be criticized? What would I do? And I really thought long and hard about this. And I was like, I would sing, because I'm so afraid to sing. And I think I'm terrible at it. And I didn't make chorus in the 6th grade because I was so shy, and it just kind of shut me out. It was one of those creativity shaming moments. And I really never sang again, not even in the shower, not with my girlfriends as teenagers. And so I joined this women's singing group. And actually just last night, I hadn't been able to go to a meeting because we've had a lot of health issues in my extended family. And there was just like, she's in this pandemic, we can't actually meet as a circles, and we can't actually really sing on Zoom because it's asynchronous. It just doesn't really work. But it was really lovely because we could mute ourselves and still sing these little songs, and they're very, they're very just spiritual songs. And I feel like in that group, there was some sharing. And one of the sharings, it's just a simple thing like, where we can talk about our distress. And it's a simple question like, I could talk about ... And for me this week, it was like, I could talk about going to a first Al-Anon meeting, which I did last week, because of an issue in my extended family. And that took a lot of courage for me, but it was really sad too. But I had this women's group where I knew that we would sing a little song, and then we would each say, I could talk about this week. Other people, were talking about standing in a peace protest and all sorts of things. So I think we have to find our communities in whatever ways, because they're nourishing.
How much trust plays some role in that community? Are you saying we can share our stress and feelings with anybody in that community?
No, I think that, a really important element that always needs to be cultivated first in any kind of group or community is safety. bar none, is that we need to feel safe. We need to feel safe with people, with the place. And this is a very important element in psychotherapy also, is that really what we're cultivating in the relationship with a client or a patient is really a sense of safety. Now, trust is really built in small moments. Trust isn't a switch that you turn on and off. Right? Trust really is built through small interactions, over time.
And do you feel that your children have been lucky to be with you because you know so many things coming from different backgrounds?
No, you know what? I think my husband and I really were very clear on our values, and I was very clear on my values as a young adult because I grew up in a broken home. And so I knew what I wanted to cultivate. But let me tell you, I have had friends who have been the most wonderful parents and who have had such heartache and hardship with just things that have happened with their children growing up. They fall into the wrong crowd, they get addicted, or there's, cheating, or a kid gets into a romantic relationship that's abusive. These things happen all the time. So what I'd like to say is that really what we can do again is cultivate a community, and that happens in a family too. And it's so important that we have our own ways to resource ourselves, because we never know what life will bring us. We never do.
Do you feel that people are scared of talking about their pain and stress in the community because of fear of judgment, fear of maybe something else?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why this idea of safety and, it's so interesting because, you've probably heard that loneliness is an epidemic, and it's as, risky as, smoking and, obesity, right? It's like 1 out of 4, right? And so there are barriers. But we live in a culture, at least in the United States, we live in kind of, we don't have kinship, there's this sense of, certain communities are very kinship oriented and there are other communities that aren't. And we have to continually foster community in whatever way that we can so that we can create safe places. And it's not always easy. And it's not that, it's so interesting, I mentioned that, I joined, or I participated in my first Al-Anon meeting, which was very instructive for me, actually, because I can easily recommend that for my clients. But for me to actually also be in a situation where I thought, I need to do this for myself. They say, right on the website, try 6 groups before you make any kind of decision. Try out different groups. And I feel like that's the same anywhere we're looking for some sort of healing, is that we need to kind of try things on for size, but we need to take that risk. We need to venture out, right? And that does take a little bit of courage to do that.
It takes courage. And this is so profound, very deep, powerful, that when we try something new, it takes a lot of courage because we have zero confidence. And
yeah,
I don't 100% agree with fake it until you make it confidence thing, because we need courage. And that's when Dr. Brené Brown talks about it's the man in the arena who counts, right? And
that's right.
Speaking of Brené Brown, you have certification in Daring Way method. Could you walk us through about that?
Well, it's not as well known up here in the Northeast. There aren't as many practitioners, but, I would say that Brené Brown was a big influence back in 2014 when her TED Talk on shame came out. And that was because most of my working with clients is around the issue of shame. And she really just brought this vocabulary into the culture. And I really admired that because it was a very no-nonsense way to kind of call out shame, and that we all have it into universal emotion. And so I was very intrigued. And granted, I had been trained actually by some wonderful feminist scholars and psychologists. And in a way, I felt like they had a branding problem. But Brené Brown figured it out, right? She was really able to kind of bring really sort of a language, very easy language, and a methodology to learning how to cultivate shame resistance. And so I was very intrigued by that. And so then when she cultivated her training program for healers and clergy, and actually leadership now, I think, is probably her mainstay at the moment. But, it's a nice method to kind of follow along. And in my private practice, when I work with women, hands down, I always give them her book, which is a couple books ago, The Gifts of Imperfection, because she has a very wonderful way of languaging the difference between perfectionism and striving for excellence. And so I have found her vocabulary and her metaphors really useful. And we do have many arenas, right? So the metaphor of the arena, like we have the arena of our family, we have the arena of our workplace, we have the arena of our community. We're always walking into arenas, right? And we need to take, it's like putting your hand on the door handle into the arena. That takes some courage. And what she says, and I think that this is what really probably intrigued me back then, is that in that arena, you can count on that you're going to have the hecklers and the naysayers and the people who built the stadium. They will always be there, right? But you need to have just two seats filled in the arena. That's the seat of empathy, and it's the seat of self-compassion.
Love it.
Right?
And actually, in January of 2020, I have this thing in my mind to start podcasting, and I didn't have any clue how I'm going to start. And I was reading Daring Greatly from Brené Brown. And when I read this thing, is The Man in the Arena, about courage. And that's how I got started.
Yes.
There is always this shame in everybody. And that shame comes around being perfectionist. If we are perfectionist all the time, nobody is going to be an author. Nobody is going to put things into the world.
That's right. And I saw that you had posted on LinkedIn, that you got a couple of rejections of, you asked people to be on their podcast and you got no's. And I had the same exact experience when I wrote my book, and you have to always find the people who are going to give like the little blurb. And I got so many no's. And I was doing, I was in a group, Mindful Self-Compassion, which is actually another really wonderful approach by Doctors Chris Germer and Krista Neff. And I had gone through that whole 8-week program because I knew as I was writing this book, my inner critic was rearing its ugly head. And I had to do so much self-compassion practices. And really, one of the things about a compassion, or a definition for compassion, is really emotional courage. It really takes emotional courage to do the things that are scary.
And it is a muscle. When we do things more and more, our muscle gets strengthened.
That's right. And that's the positivity bias, by the way. The more that you focus on these sorts of things, like you do your podcast and you do it regularly and it's become a habit for you, it becomes easier and easier. Your brain is actually rewiring itself as you're doing this. And
you talk about kindfulness. I have never heard of this word.
Oh,
mindfulness and
I did not invent the word, actually, but I love the word because it really is. So I've done a lot of mindfulness training, and a lot of the times mindfulness can be really sort of austere, right? It's really about sort of quieting the mind, letting things go. It is so hard because our minds are always busy, right? With the monkey mind, right? Always. It's just what it does. And so we have to have this element of kindness in the process. And, and people who teach mindfulness and the teachers that I really love, like Tara Cousineau and Jack Kornfield, they talk about the two wings. One is wisdom and one is compassion. And we need both. And so kindfulness, in my mind, is that melding, is that, is really being aware of the present moment with heart. Like we have to have the heart when we're doing this work.
We do. And you also talk about kind mind, open heart. Is it the change of words? Kind mind?
A kind mind, open heart. Well, I feel like that's sometimes a little bit of, sort of like a tagline for me in a way. But I do like to language things with the word kindness. So compassion is a very heavy word, right? And often when people think of compassion, they think of, the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa, or Desmond Tutu, and it feels so out of reach, right? Oh, I can never be like that, right? Compassion sometimes just feels very heavy and hard, when really what compassion is really being attuned to another person's suffering with the desire to relieve that suffering, even when we can't, right? That's what compassion is. But kindness is a word that I really love because we can all understand kindness. Like when people fill out surveys for, what they want to see in their children, in a lover, in a partner, in a boss, in a coworker, kindness is always at the top of the list, right? Kindness, friendliness,
Always.
right? It's always at the top. And yet we dismiss it. We kind of take it for granted. And so I really like to, try to language things around kindness because I feel like it's very accessible. Right? Someone doesn't have to be suffering necessarily. Like we can demonstrate kindness in all sorts of ways, right? And the kindness and, of being, happy for someone's joy, right? Or success, for instance. And, one of my pet peeves has been, the 1970s bumper stickers, doing a random act of kindness. And, I think we should all be doing acts of kindness, but they're really intentional. I like, maybe I need to do a TED Talk someday. I'm going to say that right now. But it's really about, we have to do intentional acts of kindness as a practice every single day, right? Buying the cup of coffee for the person behind is really fun, but it's not sticky. Going out and knocking on your neighbor's door and saying, I'm going to the grocery store. Is there anything that I can get you? That takes more effort, right? Takes time out of your day.
A lot of courage.
Yeah, it does, right? So, and that's actually one of the things in my book that I write about, sort of like how can we offset the spell that we fall under when we get so stressed and overworked and busy. And one of them is that we have to put in the effort, right? And again, that's where we come back to this emotional courage idea, is that it takes courage to kind of get out of our comfort zones. But the benefit is so great.
One of the kindness practices that I can recommend is, and I do it sometimes, if you're having a bad day, if you go to a coffee shop, not in coronavirus or pre-coronavirus or post-coronavirus, when you go to a coffee shop and if you're having a bad day, just buy a coffee for any stranger, just offer something. It really helps. It really helps. And it's not easy. Maybe another person would be thinking, what intention that person has, we all have this inner self-talk.
Yeah, we do. So I always recommend to someone like, well, what's a way that you can like start your day, right? Because usually we start our day with our to-do list and we start to panic right away, but it's really just to ask this question: how can I bring kindness to my day? Or how can I bring kindfulness to this moment? Right? When we're confronted with difficult people.
How did you bring kindness today, Tara?
Oh, well, today I actually feel like participating in the local march in our town. It was just it was such a simple thing, but really we all got out. I had my posters for my daughters that they used the other night at their peace protest. And it was very simple. We all met at 6:00 at 6:15. Someone rang a bell and everyone took a knee for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. And I feel like that was a generous offering that we all did as a community.
And would you recommend any book around compassion, kindness, and mindfulness for our listeners?
Oh my gosh. I could just recommend so many. I could recommend my book, which is called The Kindness Cure. The Kindness Cure. I would also recommend a book called Mindful Compassion by Paul Gilbert, Radical Acceptance and True Refuge by Tara Cousineau. She just actually wrote a book called Radical Compassion, which is the RAIN technique, which is a technique that I teach all the time. She's one of my teachers. Brene Brown's books, of course, are wonderful. Pema Chodron. There's no shortage of books on practicing mindfulness and compassion, and experiment. And there's no shortage of podcasts either, right? Or apps for, or apps, we need to take in the good all the time, and we need to get it in whatever ways that we can.
Every episode of my podcast is based on mindfulness, compassion, and kindness.
I know.
Not to promote that anyways. I digressed.
Yes, right. But you're living it, right? You're living it and you're teaching it and you're spreading it out into the world. And it's there. It's there in front of us when we're willing to pay attention.
People don't do it.
I think we get distracted. I think it's I always say that kindness is an issue of attention. is that we get distracted because of the negativity bias or our to-do list, or we get caught under a spell of stress and that sort of thing. And we don't stop to pause. And we really need to do that sacred pause so that we can redirect our attention to generativity in some way.
Can we be more kind through meditation?
Absolutely. And the reason why meditation or mindfulness skills is that we reduce our stress, right? We can reduce our own physiology in our bodies. It is very difficult to be kind if you're in survival mode or if you're in a heightened state of distress, right? In that moment, you would just are trying to take care of whatever's happening right now. But by practicing mindfulness and by practicing just really learning how to settle the nervous system is such a gift to oneself.
Can we say mindfulness is a placebo?
Well, I don't know, because mindfulness is an actual skill. It's an actual ability, right? There are many people who say that they do mindfulness and they're not doing mindfulness. I don't know if they're necessarily happier. I guess that would be an interesting experiment. But I really think that one of the benefits of mindfulness practice is how we alter our physiology and how we cultivate that compassion muscle, right? It's very tied in to our bodies.
And Tara, before I ask you my last question, I would like to ask you, what makes you happy and fulfilled in life after you have done so many things? Compassion, kindness, mindfulness.
What makes me happy? Well, besides the obvious, like I love watching my daughters grow up. It just brings me immeasurable joy. But on a daily basis, what brings me just very simple happiness is when I can leave my office, because I'm doing all these Zoom after Zoom after Zoom calls, and even for 20 minutes, is I go up the street to this beautiful estate that's now a historic site, and I just walk among the trees. And I just sit and breathe in nature. And I'm telling you, it is almost the best fix I can get in any day. It really makes me happy. And then I come back to my work, I come back to my family, and I feel nourished and restored. So very simple things make me happy.
That is so perfect. Sacred pause, because we human beings don't want to pause. We just want to keep going and going, never want to stop.
Listen, so many of us are missing out on our own lives because we're not paying attention.
Exactly.
Really. Mm-hmm.
And to continue on that topic in some other podcast, so to conclude this conversation, I would like to ask you, where can our listeners find you online?
Oh, you can find me at my website, which is my name, TaraCousineau.com. And you can also find my meditations. And I have a perfectionism course on Insight Timer app for any listeners who like that app. It's a great app for finding and experimenting with all kinds of guided imagery and meditations. So you can find me there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tara. It has been an amazing, mindful, compassion conversation with you.
Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode today. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, or you can visit https://nishantgarg.me, nishantgarg.me. You can also share this episode with your loved ones to help them live a fulfilled life. You are not alone in this journey. We all struggle in life. There is no shame in talking about it. I go through my highs and lows. I get depressed, and these practices help me in living a resilient life. You can also do this. You got this. Don't judge yourself. You are doing the best you can. And thank you so much again. Any advice dispensed in this interview is purely for educational purposes. The content here should not be taken as medical or mental health advice. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any related questions.